It's fascinating how dots get connected. I'm enthusiastic about helping people tell their stories in podcasts for the public to hear. And now also in private audio formats they can share just with their family, friends, and descendants. This year, as soon as I became committed to the project of guiding people through private audio recording, along came some people and resources to help me better understand how to do that. It's amazing how making connections works. One of them is my guest, Sylvia Lovely. I'm Tom Haley, and this is Bluegrass Region Voices and Views. Sylvia has a project where she helps people write, record, read, tell, and share the stories of their lives. She does this through workshops both in person and online. Here's a list of some of the tools she uses: self-study story journals, tailored workshops and retreats, writing groups, listening sessions, focus groups, and book clubs. A paragraph from her website says, "Join me on a journey to discover the power of stories to fuel the wisdom that embraces both who we are and the better, more fulfilled self we can be." Sylvia shares some of her personal story in this conversation. Drop in as she tells us where she was born and raised. And we recorded this conversation in the community room at Good Foods Co-op on Southland Drive here in Lexington, Kentucky. So enjoy some of the restaurant's ambient sounds.
Well, I was born in Frenchburg, Kentucky. The circumstances of my birth were my father was trying to farm. He was a typical product of Kentucky in that he was very uneducated. I think he left school. If he went through the 8th grade, I'd be surprised. Raised in the hollers around West Liberty. Was trying to farm. That was his beloved thing to do. And I had a brother, and they had a rented farm where I-64, I'm dating myself, where I-64 goes through. And the morning I was born, it was the worst November on record with snowfall. And he tells this story of putting rags on his tires, going over the mountain, which really isn't a mountain except if it's snowing, right? And got my mother to the hospital, a charity hospital in Frenchburg, Kentucky, and I was born there. He came back the next morning to pick us up, and the nurse said, "You're not taking that mama and that baby home in this weather." He said, "I ain't got no money, I ain't got no insurance, I'm taking them home." So
and he did.
He took me home, and then I think I was the straw that broke the camel's back because they left soon after, when I was about 3 months old, for Ohio, which was the promised land for people like my dad. And he went to work in the gigantic factories, National Cash Register. He made little tiny parts of cash registers, and if you're under 40, you don't even know what that is.
That's true. Right. Yeah. Now they bring a little thing over to your table, and
I marvel at it. I look at that, and I'm like, NCR raised me.
Yeah, that's right.
NCR sent me to college, and there it is. It's just this tiny little box now.
So you don't have any memories of the farm at all?
None whatsoever. But the really good news was my father got to come home to Lexington, Kentucky he got laid off at age 55 with nothing, no prospects, because of computerization of NCR, which we now see Starbucks and everywhere. The little NCR things are not cash registers anymore.
Right.
And so he was laid off, hated computers for the rest of his life because they put him out of work. But he got to come home to Kentucky.
Frenchburg?
No, to Kentucky, to Lexington, to help take care of my boys. I traveled a lot in my job, and my husband was out a lot. He's a lawyer. And my dad got to be home with the boys and my mother.
Nice.
So it was beautiful. But I do have one quick story about my dad's farming.
Yeah.
So he didn't have a farm in Lexington, Kentucky. But when I came home one day, I noticed we had cleaned out the flower beds in front of the house to plant our bushes, traditional suburban first home. And he had planted his tomato plants where the bushes were supposed to go in front of them. And I remember being embarrassed deathly embarrassed. Daddy, why did you do this? And they grew like Jack and the Beanstalk.
In the front of the house.
Yeah, and the neighbors were like, what? Tomatoes? Anyway, I look back on it now and I'm like, I was ashamed of that. What was wrong with me?
Hope you got some pictures. But
I didn't because I was angry.
Okay, sure. Well, let's continue back in the early days, and let's go way back to what is your first ever memory?
Oh, my first ever memory. Ooh, I can't remember exactly what would have been first, but maybe one of the more interesting ones is I remember discovering that I breathed.
You discovered that? How did that work?
I don't know. I just remember standing outside when it must have been 3, 2, I don't know, and realizing that my chest was, which is fascinating to me because I meditate, and it's all dependent on breath.
Breath. There you were. You were ahead of your time. I was ahead of
my time. I recognized that breathing was essential for life and living.
That is a very unique first memory.
Yeah, there you go.
I love that. Well, what's the first job that you ever had where you got paid?
Okay. My first job, and I remember being obsessed with wanting a job. So the minute I could drive, I got a job. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first little tiny car my dad got because it was real far away. It was a mall in Dayton, Ohio. And I went to work back then, I don't know so much now, they had these young girls that worked, and we all wore uniforms. It's sort of like candy stripers in hospitals. Mm-hmm. We had on the same uniforms. And I remember the fashion director, it was Elder Behrman's, I think. And I remember her scolding me because my clothes were not as ironed as she liked.
Oh, okay.
And I attribute that. My parents were dear, loving people, but they were not modern people. They were country people. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they realized that they sent me to work, and I didn't realize that I had wrinkled clothes. So it was kind of an interesting thing. I mean, she took an interest in me. That's the good news. And the only other thing I remember is we would, on purpose, drop in the candy department. The big department stores had candy departments. We would drop candy on the floor so that we could justify picking it up and eating it.
There you go.
Why not?
Can't sell that now. That's right. Wow. Well, as you know, I'm really interested in storytelling, which is one of the reasons that I am so into podcasting. So what, and I know that you're involved with it in a big way, so tell us a little bit about what is going on today with the workshops that you do on storytelling, writing. Okay. I think you're planning to do something on speaking. But before we get into that, so I want to make sure that that's top of mind. But talk a little bit more about the early days with high school, college, law school.
Well, okay, I went to Morehead State University.
Okay.
And I remember making the choice to do that one day. In my family, you didn't leave home. You stayed, you maybe had a trailer up above the old homestead or something. That was the model of living with extended family. And I remember vividly walking into the living room one day, and I made top grades and all that kind of stuff, so I could go anywhere I wanted. And I looked at my mother, because she wanted me to go to Wright State, which was in Dayton, and I could stay at home. And I said, I think I need to leave home. And there was silence suddenly. It was like E.F. Hutton, remember the old commercials? When E.F. Hutton speaks, the world would stop. And she started to cry.
Oh.
She was just bawling her eyes out, and I finally was just ready to give in. And she said, it's okay. You can go, but you have to go to Morehead, because that's home. Because if you know, Morehead State University is in Morehead, Kentucky, which is near where Owingsville, near West Liberty, where they were raised. So I went home, kind of.
Okay.
And so I went to Morehead State University, and then didn't really think much about what I was going to do. I mean, remember, I come from a background where, just going to college was an amazing thing.
Deal.
Finishing high school was an amazing thing. And I just remember so well, somebody said, well, Sylvia, you ought to go to law school. I'm like, well, why not?
This was while you were at Morehead. Someone said that, okay.
Somebody said, go to law school. I'm like, well, sure, why not? I don't know what lawyers do, but it sounds kind of interesting. So I did. Okay. I went to UK Law School. But I do remember an incident at a party when I was getting ready to go to law school, getting ready to enter the freshman class, 1L, and a law professor was there. So very proud of myself, I walked up and I said, Ms. Osnes was her name. I said, I'm going to law school next year, expecting, of course, this outpouring of, oh, that's wonderful. And no, she scrunched up her face and she says, why are you going to do that?
Oh, no.
Why don't you? Bernie was an English major. I was an English major, and we were writers. And she said, why don't you become travel writers? You can travel the country. And I'm like, not me. I'm going to go to law school.
So you mentioned Bernie. So you want we need you to bring him into this here.
Yes.
In a moment.
Very much my partner.
Okay. So did you meet at law school?
No, we met at Moorhead.
Oh, you met? Okay.
He was on the literary club, and you had to interview. You had to be selected to be in the literary club. And so he was on the panel that selected me. That's how we met. And it was great. I think it was the first time I ever encountered the strangeness of stories that people tell. They're not always consistent, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. I thought of him in terms of a Volkswagen Beetle, because it was during the height of student activism, and he was very active in all the movements that were going on at the time, had long hair, all the kind of stuff that I think you called hippies at the time. And I remember walking from the library, and I was a studier. I was always at the library. And he picked me up for a first date, and we walked toward the student center at Moorhead, and I saw this red hot car. I mean, it had like the little wires off the hood and all that. And I'm looking around for a Volkswagen Beetle, and this car was sitting there, it was still running, and it was vroom, 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 vroom. And I'm like, you don't fit this car.
That's interesting. What kind of car was it? Do you remember?
It was a red Fortino, a Forino, some kind of red hot.
Okay.
Wires, loud engine. I don't know. Yeah. It was a big deal.
Did he go to law school before you did? Or?
No, he went afterwards.
Oh, okay.
My husband, Bernie, is a gifted teacher of literary works, and his specialty was Black literature. And it's some of the most beautiful writing that you have ever read or heard. And he can talk about it for hours because he never finished his PhD. Because at that time you couldn't get jobs in English literature with a PhD from UK. You had to go to Harvard or someplace like that. There just weren't any jobs. So he went on to law school. We settled in Florida for a couple of years. I finished school at Florida Southern. He taught at a small college, and then we came back, and he went to law school after me. So, yeah. So then I went to work as an assistant attorney general. Okay. And that was how I began my legal life.
And we can easily assume everybody knows what an assistant attorney general does,
Probably
but maybe not. So
Probably think it's a lot more important than it really was because of the way it sounded.
Yes.
I remember getting an award from my high school. Drove all the way up there, to give a speech, get an award, and be in their honor or whatever up on the wall. And somebody was saying, and you're an assistant attorney general. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about something else. I mean, it's an important job, don't get me wrong. It's just that it isn't as probably glamorous as maybe it comes across sounding.
How long did you do that?
2 years.
2 years, okay.
2 years.
And then what other types of things were you involved with at that time in your life that have maybe sort of influenced, or some people use the word informed, I think, what you are interested in today?
I never was really very interested in law. Okay. I did tax and estate work in Florida. I took the Florida bar exam first, so I practiced law down there. And it really wasn't my cup of tea. I'm a lover, not a fighter. And tax and estates isn't really like that. It isn't like litigation in court, but it just wasn't my thing. So I was always casting about for something a little bit different. And what I eventually found that I loved was what was then known as the Kentucky Municipal League. Later became the Kentucky League of Cities. And I remember my predecessor came in one day to my office. I was a lobbyist for them. And he said, you ought to apply for my job. I'm leaving, and you should apply for my job. And I'm like, wait a minute. At that time, I had 6 and 8-year-old boys. And I said, I don't want to do what you do, which is fly around the world and all that kind of stuff. And he said, oh, no, it's about to plateau. It'll be fine. You'll be fine. So I applied, got the job. And it was wonderful. I mean, it's a great organization. It's now, I'm not there anymore, but headed up by just a brilliant young man that I hired, so I'm proud of that.
Okay. How long did you do that?
25 years.
Oh, 25 years.
Yeah,
okay.
I was there for a long time. And that's how I discovered stories, by the way.
Okay.
I became best friends with several of the mayors. wonderful salt-of-the-earth people in the world.
Yeah.
And one of them was named Paul Smith, and he was the mayor of Burkesville, Kentucky. So I learned stories from Paul Smith. He was a general in the Army. Came home to Burkesville, Kentucky. And these are stories that are told by these people. It's amazing, the people that serve in our small towns. And he came home to care for an ailing mother. And he built the biggest house in Burkesville on the banks of the Cumberland River. And it's beautiful. And, or was, I haven't been there for a long time. But the mother died, and he couldn't sell the house. So he became the mayor.
Okay. The house was too expensive for anybody to buy.
Yeah, people just didn't do that.
Yeah.
And so he had been going to settle in Florida, but he ended up not settling in Florida, and he stayed there. And one day he said to me, he says, Sylvia, you meet the most incredible people on the road, and you're on the road all the time. You meet these people, and they have stories. Why don't you start writing those stories? I said, look, I barely can get through a day. I have 6 and 8-year-old boys. I never spend the night anywhere. I'm always home. I have to get home. How would I have time to write stories? No, he said, you don't have to write them today. You just, and this is old school, use index cards and write out just the bare outlines of a story. And then later, you can expand on the story. Sort of like what I tell students today, write in a journal, kind of dump your thoughts in a journal, and then curate the journal.
Right.
Find the stories that really piqued your interest and develop them. So that's what I did, and I have stacks of index cards. And I mean, just the most beautiful salt-of-the-earth stories that you can imagine.
And if you hadn't written those down,
They'd
most
be
of them would
lost.
just disappear, right?
They'd be
They
lost.
just evaporate.
In fact, I captured them some in my books. I wrote 2 little books, a little red book of everyday heroes and a little blue book about cities, just city projects. But some of those stories are hilarious. Just funny little vignettes that I found about these folks. I remember interviewing the city councilman in Paducah, a city councilman in Paducah. And we, over the radio, came a report that there had been a robbery at the Walmart. And if you're not into cities, you don't know, but at one time, the big box stores were sucking the life out of little downtowns. They transformed our little downtowns. They're just not what they used to be. They've kind of, in some cases, recovered. But he started musing about that. He kind of sat back and he said, I guess everybody ends up at Walmart, even thieves.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
I know, just many, many stories just like that.
Well, elaborate on the books a little bit more. So tell us about those books.
Yes, they were a labor of love. Again, I tell little vignettes about these wonderful people because I think our political system, people are really much maligned, and they're kind of like, why would you do that? And if you do that, there's something wrong with you, i.e. running for office. And yet, these are just dear people. Many of them retired. And some of the stories, the band director, an internationally known band director in Glasgow, Kentucky, became the mayor. Mayor Honeycutt became my dear friend. I just remember one thing when I was telling him one day about my big visions about, economic development in our cities and what we were going to do. And I remember him wagging his finger at me, "Don't you get too ahead of me, little girl."
Okay.
They weren't always politically correct.
Yeah.
But, just wonderful, wonderful people. And so I wrote about them and wrote about their stories and tried to, the aim of the book was to say, hey, stop. These are good people. Maybe we could use a little red book today.
And tell
to talk about.
tell us the titles of the books and where people could find them.
Little Red Book. Well, actually, I have the only copies left. The Little Red Book of Everyday Heroes and the Blue Book. I can't remember the exact name of it. So I give those away and to my classes because a lot of them want to publish books, but they don't know how and they think it's very hard. Those went through a traditional publisher. I did self-publish a book later on, Dodging Coconuts, How to Rebuild Your Life after something happens to you. And I had a couple of hiccups, as we all have in our lives. And I wrote about that, how you can recover kind of a cathartic healing story, Dodging Coconuts.
And that's available on Amazon.
On Amazon.
And I actually have read it. I read the Kindle version and enjoyed it very much. So
well, the whole idea behind it was one of the things I tell my students and myself, I'm an avid reader of newspapers. Go for the little tiny stories, not the great big ones. Go for the little ones that tell stories. because you can expound upon them. And I remembered this story during a typhoon in the Philippines several years ago, when a gentleman moved his family to higher ground with the impending storm. And he stayed down below next to the sea with the small subsistence farm that they had to keep the animals safe and all of that. And coconuts, which nourish you in good times, you're sitting by the pool and you're kind of laying there and the breeze is swaying the coconuts and it's all good until the storm comes up and they start flying.
Okay.
And one struck him in the leg. Because they weren't prepared, the state or the country was not prepared, he died of gangrene, leaving a family without its breadwinner. And so I call it dodging coconuts.
Yeah.
Because you got to kind of know there's a percentage of life that you can't control. But what you can control is your own reaction and being prepared, not to the point where you're not a risk taker. One of my favorite kinds of stories are healing stories. People who have been through very rough patches in their lives and need to write about it, need to tell the stories. And it's a very specific kind of storytelling because you don't want to re-traumatize somebody by having them live through whatever traumatized them to begin with. And so it's a very prescriptive kind of writing that I'm really loving and probably will get more into.
Well, let's move into that then. I know that you're known as the story doula.
Yeah, I love this.
And you help people write stories, not just healing stories, but other types of stories. You do workshops on it, do speaking engagements, and so on. So if you would take as deep a dive as you would like into the world of being a story doula.
Okay, well, let me explain what a doula is. Starting to be a term being used a lot. Doulas were this term was invented, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's women who assist other women in childbirth. So it's kind of the creation of life, the beginning of life that they facilitate as a doula. Well, doula has been expanded. Not only have I stolen the title as a story doula, helping people create their stories. They don't know they have them. Maybe they're in the subconscious. I help them bring them to the fore. Sort of, and scientifically, this is known, just like yoga or mindfulness or meditation. I always say mediation because I'm a lawyer, I guess. But it's a little like mediation. You're bringing people together. You're bringing thoughts together. And so that's what a doula does. Like there's death doulas now that help people prepare for dying. It's the inevitable thing. Everybody will. And yet nobody wants to deal with it, right? I actually have a death doula who's in my class, which I think is fascinating, too. I want to talk to her sometime. So that's what a doula is. And my interest in all of that, maybe it was born with Mayor Smith that day when he said, start keeping the stories. I enjoyed the stories probably more than I did the intricacies of legislation, which if you think about it, I should have liked that better, right? But I like the stories better. And to this day, what's so wonderful is to bring a class together. And I started teaching at Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning, in addition to doing some of my law work on the side, and I'm still doing that. Just trying to do a little less of that and a little more of the stories. But Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning is a fabulous organization in downtown Lexington. It's the old Carnegie Law Library, and there are several around the country that were established. I don't even know when they were established, but it's an old library-like building that houses an incredible number of classes that people can take, children. But I've been doing my work through a partnership they have with Good Foods Co-op, which is where we are today.
Right.
In the community room.
Yeah.
And the Good Foods Co-op is about community and food, right? If you think about the words that come to mind, probably food first, and then sort of building community around farms and local foods and all of that kind of stuff. So their partnership with Carnegie is really valuable. And one of the reasons it's valuable is one of the reasons I'm here and like this is Carnegie is downtown with very limited parking.
Yeah.
And if you talk to someone in this end of town, they're like, well, Lexington's getting big enough that that's like a foreign country. Not that I'm saying that's a good thing. It's just that's what people think. So one of my objectives, whenever I'm teaching a writing class or anything I'm doing with a group of people, I bring them together first into a community. And I try to reach out to what maybe we want to loosely refer to as suburban people, people who don't go downtown on a regular basis, people who we need to draw into this because it's amazing. They come out of the woodwork, they're interested. And maybe you can like cars or not like cars, but there's parking. People can come here, they can relax.
Get a tea like I did.
They can get a tea. It's just, see the big picture of Wendell Berry,
Right.
and his sense of community. So that's an important thing about my writing classes. They're not just writing. And in fact, one of the things I like to, I'm not going to use the word discourage, but I don't encourage publishing to sell your books or be on the Oprah Winfrey Book Club.
Okay.
Because I think it's very likely you won't be. But you can learn to love exploration of your stories and engaging in your stories. And scientifically, it's proven to improve your health, to improve your sense of happiness, just like all the other kind of Eastern religions, spiritual growth, which can be religious or not religious. All of those things go into making people more engaged with the world and with the small things of life. My son, who just moved to Duluth, Minnesota, I love Duluth, by the way. I'm one of the few people in the world that thinks it's just grand. It's on the shores there of Lake Superior, which is my muse. I love Lake Superior. But he's a storyteller, too, and he's a writer. And he called me and he said, Mom, fellow that lived in the house he just bought died in December, and he bought the house in March, a 100-year-old house. But he was down in the basement, and he opened the dryer, and there were still clothes in the dryer.
Oh.
Isn't that poignant?
Yeah.
And I said, well, what were they? Tell me about the clothes. So, you can construct a whole story around this gentleman who nobody knew. I didn't know him. And, about the things he left in a dryer. The tiny pieces of life. In fact, I'm blogging for Good Foods Co-op now. Okay. And I wrote a story. I wrote my blog about the tiny pieces of life, including little items that you find in an attic, treasures.
Where do the blog posts appear?
They're on the Good Foods Co-op website.
Okay.
Yeah. So people like to go and it's marked blogs. And so I do that about once a month.
Okay. I'll have a link in the show notes to that.
Oh, that'll be nice.
Yeah, those things that are like left in the dryer, so to speak, when you could use that as, I'm not sure what the literary term would be, but that could be a title of a book, The Things We Leave in the Dryer.
The Things We Leave, yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and it's about, I'll probably tell the story of my mother, too.
Sure.
Those little things, the little tiny things that you don't think are important. It's a good way to be more alive, is to appreciate the little tiny things of your life and to make up stories of a cup of coffee with a friend or some affirmation of wisdom that you kind of knew but you hadn't thought about in a while. Have you ever had that happen? Where you're just having that moment and it's like, oh, wow.
It's one of my favorite things to do. I call it out around the bluegrass.
I see that.
And I had a coffee meeting this morning at 10 o'clock at Joseph Beth with a writer friend of mine and with F.J. Messina, and I always walk away with something.
With a gem.
Like that was definitely worth it.
And think about that accumulated wisdom. That's what a life is all about, isn't it? Is that accumulated thinking, building. And that's why I emphasize sharing. And that's why I emphasize presentation skills, too. Think about it. If you can regale somebody with your story, isn't that much better than if it's just cold and dry? That's an important thing, too.
Well, speaking of cold and dry, I would think that a lot of us feel like that's how our stories would come across. But I would think that there is some impediment that comes up regularly when you're talking with people about telling their stories, something that a lot of us have in common that stops us from moving ahead with it. Can you think of some things that people say, well, here's the problem I'm having with telling my story? Is there anything like that?
I think so. I think that we can be intimidated by our story, or we think that somebody's going to think less of us if we did something stupid in our lives, and almost everybody has. And a setback. There are people who don't want to talk about setbacks. And yet they're such a part of life. And so, I try to tread gently there. But what I find in a lot of my classes, I have one student, for instance, that constantly writes of her brother's suicide because she's constantly dealing with it. And the other class members say, can you write a happy story? So she's been trying to write happier stories, but she has this need to write about her brother. And I'm not interfering with that because I think that need is something that's maybe therapeutic for her that we don't know. I think we have to respect so much people's individual needs, and if they don't, even if they don't, I've read stories where in a classroom, for instance, you might do a lunch and learn with a group of business employees who want to do things, which is something that really interests me because we're disengaged, right? I mean, that's what they tell us. We're disengaged from our work. We don't know if it was the pandemic. We don't know what it was. But if you can get people to come together, maybe even at first they won't speak, but then they start seeing other people do. And, well, yeah, I can do that. That's kind of interesting. And they start talking about the simplest things. I give them prompts and let them run with it. The other day I asked, in the class that's going on right now that I'm teaching at Good Foods Co-op, I said, describe something that gave you a sense of wonder in recent days. Wonder, because that's an odd term. But a sense of wonder to me is something that is just a revelation almost. And a sense of, and mine, I used an example, was my grandson, 14-year-old grandson, was home with me one day not feeling well. So he was up and sitting at the table when I got in, and in my legal work, I deal a lot with people who have made bad decisions. And then I'm trying to disentangle them from that. And I said to him, he's 14, I said, will you promise me you'll not make bad decisions so that I can, rest easy?
Yeah.
And he just looked at me. Here he was, not feeling well. He said, Sibby, which is what they call me, Sibby, I promise you, I'll always make good decisions. And it was just a sense of wonder of that youth and his just innocence, because he doesn't know what's ahead of him. He has no idea what
Those
he's going to face.
Out there.
There's coconuts out there, but I'll take that answer, because it's just beautiful, because he said it with such sincerity.
Sure.
So it's a sense of wonder at youth.
Well, what is the name of your course when someone sees it on the website?
The one I'm doing right now is Writing the Stories of Your Life.
Writing the Stories of Your Life.
And it's been growing. I mean, I now have waiting lists, which is a lot of fun. I mean, we come together. It's usually in 3 parts. Come together the first time, and I've only done them. This is the first in-person one I've done. But we come together, and we get to know one another. I'll usually use a prompt, something that can kind of... tell us, what did I use the other day? Oh, it was a lot of fun. Oh, how you got your name.
Oh, okay.
It was fun.
Yeah.
It turned out a lot of fun. So everybody kind of laughs, gets to know one another, and that breaks down that wall. And then I send out lengthy emails. So I send one to begin, and then I send another one over the weekend before the next class, which is usually on Wednesdays. And so I'll send out a memo, and I'll say, here's some prompts. I especially love interviews. I tell them to interview somebody.
Oh, not one another in the class.
No, somebody else. Somebody living, dead, and a lot of times it's grandmothers. Because they were kind of the unsung heroes in their family. They stood in the shadows, and Grandpa was a successful businessman or something. So a lot of times I get grandmothers. Okay. But, interviewing people, just living or dead, and what they would imagine they would say to them or ask them. So that's a fun one. I enjoy that. And, so that's what I do. I do prompts, and then they write. They can choose. Some of them have written already, and I don't even have to prompt them. And I encourage them to look for small moments. Nature in the spring, or somebody wrote a beautiful essay on a bowl of tomato soup. I mean, just a bowl of tomato soup. And I was going to tell you the story of my mother. when she was dying of cancer. She kept hoping for a cure, and we knew not likely. But she refused to be in a wheelchair or anything like that. And I remember taking her to a palliative care doctor whose only job was to lessen her suffering. And so she refused any help, and she crawled up on the examining table. And he said, "Mrs. Leach, tell me what you like to do so that I can help you do it better and more." And she was so weak at this point, and she lifted her little head and she said, "I like to do little things." And I thought it just so captured. And a couple of days later, it was Christmas time, and I took her to Walmart, and there were the little green and red velvet dresses, and she would like finger them as she imagine when you're probably know you're not going to, what wonder
you're seeing this for the last time probably
can mean to you.
Yeah.
And it did. It did.
So when your students are in the class, how long is the class? And sort of take us through, besides the prompts, what goes on in a class?
Well, one of them, probably the challenging things, is critiquing each other.
Okay.
Because some people really want that, and some people are a little more sensitive to it. So the kind of rule of thumb of that is encourage and then offer maybe a suggestion if you have one. There was a story once that I loved, and the woman started out with her story it was about a funeral home. And she started it out with telling where the funeral homes were that her father owned in someplace, Texas or something. And then she got to the part where she was talking about, he came home one day and he got one morning and he said, "Get your good clothes on, your Sunday clothes and your nice shoes, and we're going to the funeral home." And we're all sitting there like, why? I don't get this. And came to the part where he took them to the funeral home to be the witnesses and the family, in quotes, of someone who had none.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that beautiful?
That is.
And she said he started taking them whenever he had a pauper funeral. They would go. They would dress up in their good clothes and their shoes and stand vigil over that person that had no one else. And I said, I'd start with that.
Yeah.
Lead with that story. Don't lead with, tell me about the businesses later, because I don't really care. But I love that story. And it was beautiful.
Sure. So the people actually will write during the class?
No, they write in between classes.
And
then they come and they present.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Now, one of the things I'm trying to inch them into is presentation skills.
I was going to say, a lot of people would be intimidated by reading their...
But not
they're
reading.
Not really.
They get better with reading.
Okay.
But what I really want them to do is stand up and actually present their story. And the reason I kind of want to do that is, one, even if you have to write it first in order for it to get there. And one of my favorite writers in my class is Retha. Retha's 79 years old, and her voice needs to be heard. I mean, I can read Retha's story, but I can present her story. I tell about it a lot because I love her story called Pants. But only she can voice it with that craggly kind of 79-year-old voice. But the reason I want people to learn how to present is, one, you write a story that's compelling. I mean, who wants to read, or, even if it's your great-great-great-grandchildren someday, wouldn't it be better to have a written story?
Yeah.
But the other reason that I like this is it's very here and now to present your story. And if you're into publishing, which is okay, I mean, if you've got something that you want to publish, then go for it. But to me, it's not as rewarding as standing up and telling a story and getting that audience engaged. And there's a wonderful website, themoth.org, where people do 5-minute stories. And that's the other thing. Do it in 5 minutes. What was it Mark Twain said? Let me make sure I get this right. I would write you a short letter, but I only have time to write you a long one.
Okay,
Don't you love that?
He's not have time to edit. So.
Yeah. That's what I try to tell them is, short. Make it short. Make it punchy. If you can do 5 minutes, you can do 2 minutes. You can excerpt and you can extract and do 30 minutes if you need to. But get it down to 5 and make all your points. And we talk a lot about story structure, like the funeral story. Start with something that's going to grip your audience, whatever it is, your family, your children, wherever, or if you're making a speech, doing a TED Talk, who knows, grip people from the beginning with a story. And then stories follow similar lines. If you go to the movies, you know this. They start out with something, the hero meets with a bit of trouble. And along the way, the hero kind of dips down maybe 2 or 3 times. And usually someone comes along to help the protagonist. Maybe it's a hero that comes, like in Star Wars. And then at the end is the arc of resolution. Make them feel good at the end. Make people feel like that worked.
And you teach that in the class?
And we talk about structure.
Okay.
But I tell you one thing that I don't do. I don't stand up and teach grammar or any of those kinds of things. I just let it happen organically. Usually I have so many students and we have so little time that we, by reading and just commenting on a piece of writing, takes up all of our time.
How long is a typical class?
Well, I'm teaching in person 2 hours for each session, and that's 3 different sessions. And so, but usually it's an hour and a half when we're on Zoom.
Okay.
And I'll be looking at some of that, whether it needs to be restructured. Subject matter, like I said, I'm interested in healing stories, helping people understand trauma better. And I teach also for the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Tell us about that.
It's fascinating because these are people, either they're caregivers or they're people with mental illness. And they write through that trauma as well. And I think probably my favorite are the caretakers who want to help people. Maybe they want to tell their church sisters and brothers about what they're experiencing, because there's a lot of mental illness in the world and how you cope with it. And they do a lot of writing about that. So it's kind of a mixture of caregivers and people who actually have mental illnesses and write about it.
You do that here in Lexington? Is that
Online.
for like NAMI or?
Yeah, NAMI. That's who it is.
Okay.
It's not NAMI of Lexington, it's NAMI Kentucky.
Okay.
So it's a statewide organization.
And you do it online. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Wow.
Which is okay. I prefer
in person, but yeah.
But, people have gotten used to. I have people from California, Indiana.
Yeah, that's one advantage. But
or in poor health. I've got one student, wonderful woman, Christy Cassidy, who has a miniature horse. I'm serious, a miniature horse and now she's ill right now, but when she's back at it, she takes him to memory units. She's written the most beautiful stories about Winston connecting with someone who has memory loss.
Wow.
And dementia. And that's beautiful. Like, can you imagine parking next to someone that gets their miniature horse out of the back seat
and walks into the facility? Wow.
Fascinating.
Well, you mentioned one time to me at one of our fun coffee breaks that your dad had a story about things never working out. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks for reminding me of that. I love that story because it's kind of the preface to my healing stories. Okay. He was giving advice to my son, who probably was graduating from something and had been suffering the first sense of angst over not getting some kind of something. I don't know what may have happened. But he was giving him advice, and he must have been in his 80s. And he said, finally, David was so exasperated, and my dad said, "David, things never work out." Which is just amazing to me because my dad was an optimist. He was a jolly man. My mother wasn't particularly, but my father was. And I was like, why did he say that? He had to leave his farm. He had to go to work in a mind-numbing job. And then it came to me. He was born in the holler. One of 10 kids, had to leave school early. His father died at age 42. And I said, "Daddy, didn't you take him to," he was wasting away, I guess, a wasting away kind of thing. Probably cancer, I don't know. And I said, "Why didn't you take him to the doctor?" And he started laughing. He said, "Sylvia, we didn't go to doctors back then." Because remember, they didn't have the safety nets then and all of that kind of stuff. But he enlisted. So he got to see the world, not from the best part of the ship, but he went over to Okinawa, and he He's proudly displayed those pictures. So he talks about it as seeing the world. Then he came back and he tried to farm. Couldn't do that. I got in the way. My brother got in the way, right? And so I got on that ribbon of a highway to Ohio, the promised land, and got to work in NCR. But what he got to accomplish, even though it never worked out the way he really wanted it to, his overriding goal in life was to move his family into a better place. And did he ever? I mean, I got to go to college.
Yeah.
My brother got to go to college. That was unheard of to my family. And so...
If he hadn't moved to Ohio, that wouldn't have happened.
It wouldn't have happened.
And tell us again, where in Ohio?
Dayton.
Dayton,
the promised land.
Well,
yeah.
I usually don't bring personal things into these podcasts, but this is a good time to mention that my mother left Monterey, Tennessee, a farm, 8 or 9 kids. I think they were at 9. And she was the youngest, and she went to Dayton, Ohio.
Dayton.
My dad left Glasgow, Kentucky, and went to Dayton, Ohio.
Wow.
And that's where they met.
Oh.
It was in Dayton. So, yeah.
Dayton in some really strange ways. You know, I took voice lessons once.
No.
And I was told that at that time, I think I've lost this, but at that time, I had this great lucky thing. I had no accent. And that Dayton, Ohio is the only place where people don't have accents.
Just drains it right away.
I'm like, really? I mean, seriously. But do you mind if I tell my Wendell Berry story?
Please do.
I love Wendell Berry.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Him.
Yeah.
And his face is on the wall here.
At Good Foods, yeah.
Agriculture, eating is an agricultural act, is what it says. But Wendell's my hero because he's a community advocate. Even when it hurts, he's going to advocate for community. And he's not a modernist at all. And I've visited his farm several times at Port Royal, and I just loved he and Tanya. But what happened I haven't talked to him a lot since because we worked together on farm-to-table issues for cities. And he wrote an essay. And it was about an economic development project in Bowling Green, which has a lot of porous ground because of the cave systems, and a legitimate concern that environmentalists had. I think they built it after all, but there was fear that it would cave in. And he wrote this eloquent essay about that. Well, not to be outdone, I wrote a counter essay. And my essay was not to put it down, but to say, Wendell, I'm conflicted. My father left Kentucky because Kentucky didn't provide opportunity. And he left and went to work at NCR and made good middle-class wages. I wasn't raised poor. I was raised middle class. And as a result, I got to go to college. All kinds of opportunities came to me. Got it published. It was published all over the state. And then I got a letter. Now, those of you who know Wendell Berry is he types on an old Royal typewriter, right? And it was just a simple letter. I've lost it. Dear Sylvia, I am disappointed in you, Wendell.
That was it. Oh, gee.
I would frame it if I could find it.
Yeah.
To be criticized by Wendell Berry is like, the same as getting praise from just about anybody.
Maybe it's in the dryer.
It's in the dryer. Probably was left in an attic somewhere, no doubt.
Well, I know besides the coconuts that you talk about in your book, you had another literal bad break.
I did.
That was kind of a surprise. Tell us about that.
It was. It was sort of many people have larger crucibles than I do. Trust me, I know this. But I had been downsized out of my job in the recession of 2008. It was a very angry time in the world. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I think almost a precursor to some of the issues we have today.
Oh, I remember it.
Yeah, very real. The so-called Great Recession, that really was even worse than that, I think. But I was feeding my dogs one night on July 29th, 2010, and merely twisted, and my entire left leg collapsed. And I was on a prescription drug for too long, and it was disembodied. It was the first time I'd ever been sick, emergency surgery, and a pulmonary embolism. And I was told I was lucky I made it to the hospital with that. And it changed my life. It was like life-changing events in those times. And I wrote a lot about being in the hospital with a lot of broken people They were just like me. I was a lot younger than most of them because this strikes. And I was like in the 1% club on this particular.
It was your
prescription
femur,
drug.
right?
It was my femur. And it struck women. Women got this drug more often postmenopausal, but it struck people, and men and women, who were avid walkers. Because if you think about it, when you walk, your femur bears the brunt of your walking. And so that happened to me, and it took years. I was in a wheelchair, on a walker, a cane, and so it kind of set me back in terms of even starting over and starting my other, business ideas and communications business. And then I got a great opportunity with the Kentucky Access to Justice Commission, and I still do that. I kind of help people with their stories because I help people disentangle from some of their legal issues that
Okay, I'm not familiar with that word. If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Kentucky Access to Justice Commission is formed by the Supreme Court of Kentucky to help people, Justice Michelle Keller, to help people in like legal help centers or people in recovery who typically find themselves in a lot of legal difficulties. And what we do is help them out and help them get out of those difficulties. And I mean, some people have just incredibly long lists of legal entanglements, or even not just legal entanglements, but just life issues that they've gotten themselves into. So it's rewarding. I don't do a lot of it now. I work with the Legal Help Center, but it's a way to use my law degree since I never really did. I was a CEO for 25 years.
Right.
And then I tell people, as a result, I have no marketable skills.
Oh, well, I don't know about that. So do you want to talk in any more depth about the Kentucky League of Cities? That was where you were for 25 years as a CEO.
I loved it.
Yeah, and that was sort of where you, if I'm understanding right, that's where you got the inspiration to go into storytelling because of the stories that you would hear, which is what you said earlier, I believe.
Stories, beautiful stories. People who did the right thing. When they could have retired, when the band director could have retired.
Yeah.
He didn't.
Yeah.
It was a neat thing. I heard a story about him one day. He was driving away in a driving rainstorm. He had just left my office. And he had gotten maybe as far, the way I pieced it together, there was a caller on the radio who called in to talk about this wonderful man who, in a driving rainstorm, Mayor Honeycutt, I pieced it together, figured it out, had stopped when every other car whizzed by. Wow. And he stopped and put her in his car and drove her to the next stop.
Wow.
Is that just beautiful?
Yeah.
The things you do when no one's looking.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan.
And that was his, giving back. And then I heard stories about how when he'd take his band around the South, the Glasgow band was well known, and he would take them throughout the South, and when they wouldn't serve him because he had black band people, he would march them right out the door.
Okay.
And I just thought, wow, people don't know these stories.
Yeah.
They need to know these stories.
And that's sort of what I think the overarching theme that I'm getting from our talk is that we all have these stories that need to be told, right? Yeah.
Why is it in this country, or in this world, we read stories to children, but then we tell them to put them away? They're starting to change that a little bit. I've seen some change where they're actually teaching children now to write in a journal.
Okay.
And to do those things. No doubt they could do more. And I heard a wonderful story the other day, Erin Gruwell, and it was the Freedom Writers Project. And she invented it. She was a young teacher in California, somewhere in California, and she had the worst students in the school dumped on her in an English class. They were surly. They were the throwaway kids. Some were in foster care. And she transformed them, and called the Freedom Writers Project. And that was a bestseller on the New York Times book.
That's writers.
Writers as opposed to writers. The Freedom Writers Project. And they started writing their stories. And she's now formed an international foundation and works with youth to help them work through their stories and understand their stories better and share their stories, because that's how we grow. we as humans, that's how we communicate. And if they've done studies that, actually whatever the stuff in your brain that is released, that's good stuff, there's more of it. It's just like studies of mediation, meditation. See, there I did it again.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, this might end up causing you to repeat something that you've already said, but that'd be fine. I'm wondering, here in the spring of 2023, when you get up in the morning, what are you thinking about that just gets you going for the day?
Well, I will make a confession. Too much.
Too many things.
You get to a certain age where you can there are things you need to work on, and I have 1,000 things going on. I have a podcast I do with my chef.
Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
And we interview restaurateurs. I love your little posts where you are, because I do the same thing. And you introduced. No, wait a minute. I'm thinking of somebody I want you to meet. Okay, but anyway, sure. I was at the pub the other day. I don't know if you've been there yet.
I have not.
But anyway, it's under new ownership. I had this delightful conversation. So I'm having him on the show. So we have restaurateurs. We bring us my chef and I, Chef Jeremy Ashby at Azure Restaurant and Patio. And I'm one of the owners. And we started this maybe 10 years ago.
We're is it that long now?
Yeah, it's that long ago. We just went podcast. It was on radio at 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. Well, you know how many people listen to the radio on Saturday afternoon? They listen to snippets. And we're also on the Jack Patty Show on Friday mornings.
Yeah.
Chef and I take turns being on the Jack Patty Show. Same thing. We have culinary stars and sort of building the culinary scene, because it is where people come to come together. Coffee shops.
Right.
We feature all kinds of, breakfast, lunch, dinner, upscale, downscale, all of that in between. And we've just gone to podcasting. And it's the very same show. So you can go to Food News and Choose on your podcast outlet, Spotify, Apple Podcast, anything out there where you get your podcasts, and that's what we do, and we have a great time. I mean, it's hilarious. We get off on tangents.
Yeah, Food News and Choose, and it's you and Chef Jeremy
and Twitch.
Yeah.
He's a well-known local radio personality, and he's a hoot. We have a lot of fun. People come in and they're nervous, and I'm like, do not get nervous with us, because we barely know what we're doing, and we just have fun.
So where are you sitting when you're doing the podcast? Where are you
in the studio.
Oh, at
the Cumulus Studios.
Which is where?
Down in the big Central Bank building.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where Jack.
That's where
show
Jack is too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Jack has a culinary hour every Friday morning from 9 to 9:30, and that's what Chef and I do. That we alternate.
Okay.
With Jack, we co-host with Jack.
Okay. Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation here, but there are a couple questions that I'd like to try to squeeze in here. I just wonder if there's something that you've done that you just loved so much that you would love to do it over again. That might have been some semester in college. Who knows what it was? Is there something that just...
Oh, probably the mayors.
Okay.
I enjoyed the mayors and the city council members. I traveled the state. We had a great time. My husband and I were reminiscing one of our annual conventions. We had Chubby Checker.
Oh,
don't you love that? And we gave the Mayor Paul Smith, my Burkesville mayor, gave him a St. Bernard. His St. Bernard had died. That was his gift. And that was a high point. I loved that.
Yeah.
So I guess my stories with my mayors.
Okay.
And that was a lot of fun. So, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, what do you see yourself doing or being maybe more deeply involved with over the next couple years?
Well, I'm trying to build this business. Now, what happens to me, I've reached the age where I just get fascinated and curious about what people are doing. So I've been networking up a storm. I've been finding out that what various parts of this business people are in. And it's a growing business as people are seeking something. Growth, some sort of growth that they're not finding. I mean, look at the world we live in today where, there's just all of this noise and trying to cut through the noise. Now, one of the things that I'm really pursuing, and I'll say it right this time, meditation. And spiritual growth.
Okay.
And I think there's story stuff in there too. I read a lot of spiritual works and exploring your stories. I mean, the Bible itself is filled with stories, right?
Right.
And so I think just helping people embrace those stories and being able to just immerse myself in understanding where I fit into that. I'm into partnering and collaborating with others. There's a lot of gifted people out there doing stuff in this space. And I'm trying to figure out, well, okay, what can I do? I'm a big, I need to make a contribution kind of person. I'm not a competitor. I'm not a hard-nosed competitor. I just want to complement what's going on and help more people.
I take it you don't spend a lot of time or don't plan to spend a lot of time in your recliner.
No, I'm afraid I'm not good at that. I'm not good at that. Don't watch television. I read constantly, and I'm reading the stories that stick. I can't remember her name. And that's an interesting one because it's about story structure and about what matters in a story for business or for nonprofits. If you're trying to raise funds, what can you do? How can you tell the story so that it really captures people? And so that's interesting. And then a book on meditation, which I love. I'm just thinking that is so great.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, a companion to stories.
So as we close, I want to make sure that we do have a couple more minutes. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that I just haven't brought up?
No, I think we've covered it really well. I am thinking about taking my Dodging Coconuts book and downsizing it.
Okay.
One of the things that I believe is, while I don't think you have to cater to every nuance of modern living, I do think the Little Red Book and the Little Blue Book were tiny books. If you can give somebody a book that they can read on a plane ride, then you've reached them. If you give them a 400-page book, unless it's from a best-selling author, they're probably not going to read it. I also don't think necessarily, and this is kind of a sad thing to say, but if you write a memoir, write it for your family. Unless you have a specific point you want to make because you want to change mindsets, then I think that's okay. But make it short and make it to the point. And so I may do some of that, tinker around with that book and see if I can make it shorter.
Okay.
Because I think I have some messages in there I'd like to deliver, but just shorter so that people can enjoy it in a short period of time and something will stick.
And you'd need a different name for it, I guess.
No, I love the Dodging Coconuts name.
But I mean, it would be the brief Dodging Coconuts, the brief version or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as you know, this is Bluegrass Region Voices and Views. And I really always end my podcast asking my guests, and I know you're in the restaurant business, so this is a bit tricky maybe. Besides Azure, let me put it that way, is there a favorite restaurant or coffee shop, ideally sort of locally owned, that you like to go to, especially maybe take an out-of-town guest to show off our local culture, but it doesn't have to be that. Any place in Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, there's some great places out in western Kentucky. What was the name? Patty's. Patty's out there on the lakes.
Okay.
It's this great place with inch-tall pork chops.
Whoa.
And 2-inch-tall meringue pies. So
Nice.
if I'm ever out in western Kentucky, and Paducah's a great culinary scene too. People don't know about these places along the way. Miguel's Pizza down by Natural Bridge.
Natural Bridge, yes.
It's supposed to be wonderful. Hope to get there sometime in the near future. And here locally, probably if I'm not at Azure, and I am there a lot, I like Giuseppe's.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Italian.
Yeah.
I like that. So,
is there a coffee shop? I know you like Panera, but I'm thinking of a local.
Oh, no. Panera's great. I like it here. I like the atmosphere here. Brewster's, you and I both like that.
Yeah, McLeod's.
And there's some new places around town. Yeah, McLeod's.
Yeah.
There's some new places around town. Oh, gosh, there's a couple of places in the Manchester area. And I can't even tell you the name of it.
Bravada, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That was a nice place.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
So as you network, you get to know the coffee shops because I actually like coffee shops for business meetings.
Okay.
Because if you're eating, you're not talking.
Yeah,
You're
that's
not
true.
asking questions, or there's these awkward moments when you're both got your mouth full or something. So
Yeah.
I much prefer a coffee shop for a
Right.
visit
Good.
with someone.
Okay. Well, then my final question, what's a venue you like to visit or activity that you like to do in Kentucky? And again, possibly where you would take an out-of-town guest to introduce them to our Commonwealth.
Probably Paducah, Western Kentucky. I might
Okay.
not take anybody there, but I like visiting there. It's a beautiful town,
Ah.
right on the confluence of all those rivers.
Mm-hmm.
Really a wonderful place.
Okay.
And I'm kind of a workaholic, so I don't get out a lot. If I
Mm-hmm.
were, I think I'd go to Raven Run probably more often, or McConnell Springs.
Yeah.
And I think about it, but being with my dog, I walk my dog. I've got kids up in Duluth, Minnesota. And that I'm going to try to spend as much time as up there as I can. I've already looked into writers groups up there, by the way.
Okay.
And there is the Lake Superior Writers Group, which I think is kind of cool.
That sounds neat. Yeah.
So there's that, and I have a full life.
Well, you've mentioned Paducah a couple of times. I have to ask you, so did you go to Paducah a lot on business? Mm-hmm. Okay, that was how you, okay.
Yeah. There's a group of cities in Kentucky that are sort of, they wouldn't like me to say this, but I'm not there anymore, so I'll say it. And I think you get second tier, but I mean in size, not in quality.
Right.
But there's Paducah, Ashland, Owensboro, which is a great town.
Sure.
Great town. Newport, Covington, Somerset.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these kind of level below Lexington and Louisville that are really rich. I mean, they're wonderful, rich in terms of they're just unique and wonderful. And so those are great places to go, and I went there a lot.
Well, here's an idea. We'll close with this. You could write a short book about these second-tier cities.
Second-tier cities, and call them something different.
Yeah, and about how they're so attractive and so on.
Thank you for the idea.
Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you
Thank
have.
you. I have. Always enjoyed conversations with you. You're so good at this.
Oh, well, thank you. You are the story doula. That is for sure.
You love that.
Thank you. And I do intend to participate in one of your classes at some time. So.
Oh, yeah. I wish you would.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I encourage you to check out Sylvia's website at sylvialovely.com and learn more about how she can help you write the stories of your life and have a fun and satisfying time doing it. Also, visit my website page at bluegrassregionvoicesandviews.com/Sylvia for this episode, or click on the link in the show notes. There you'll see a list of her books, pictures, and a link to her website. Contact me if you'd like more information about how I can guide you through the process of recording a 1-hour story about your life to share with your family and descendants in a professional-sounding audio format. I'll do all the work, and you can just have a fun and rewarding experience. Now, let's go make some connections and tell some stories.